Hi, I want to take 5 minutes of your time talking about receptive field. So we briefly touched upon this receptive field when we were doing convolutions. We said, oh, the receptive field gets bigger and bigger as you go down the network. So I want to briefly give you a feeling, right? A little bit more intuition. So the biological definition of receptive field of a neuron is the visual field in which the stimulus will modify the firing of that neuron, right? So for example, here in my peripheral vision, if you do something, the firing of the neuron in my eye, behind my eyes will change. But if you do it behind my head, then that's not in my receptive field because I don't get to see it, right? So similarly, a receptive field is essentially the local region on the output volume of the previous layer that a neuron is connected to. And the effective receptive field is the area of the original image that can influence the activation of a neuron. So what I mean by this is, so this is the immediate receptive field, right? So when you're doing convolution or transposed convolution or dilated convolution, you see when we're doing convolution, this dark square that you see, that is the receptive field, right? That is the size of the kernel. And when my size of the kernel in this case happens to be, looks like 4 cross 4, it only gets to see that 4 cross 4 part of my image. If you're doing transposed convolution, it gets to see, so it's a bit weird. But then when you're doing dilated convolution, even with, let's say, a 3 cross 3 kernel size, you get to see this 5 cross 5 because you're not looking at contiguous pixels, right? So the receptive field in this case is, let's say, 5 cross 5, and in this case, it's 4 cross 4. The kernel size in this case is 4 cross 4. The kernel size in this case is 3 cross 3. Right. So the receptive field for a very direct convolution is just the size of the kernel, and in the dilated convolution it's slightly different. But when we go down the network, right, I mean, I don't want to get to details in the math here. I recommend you look at this paper if you need to, and also convolutional neural networks are slightly going out of, let's say, fashion. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but I wanted to kind of show you this image, right? So let's say we have our input image of size height cross width cross 3 for the number of channels. Let's say, it's, let's say, a 512 cross 512 image. And what we are saying is we have first a convolution of, say, of kernel size 9 cross 9. Then we have a pooling layer, right? So pooling layer, you remember, let's say max pooling, we reduce the size of the image. So the size of the image then goes from 512 to, let's say, 256 here. And then we again have, let's say, a convolutional layer, and then we have a pooling layer, right? So the pooling will again bring it to 128, and then we have a convolution layer and a pooling layer, right? And the kernel size of the convolution layer is always this 9 cross 9 at least until here. Sometimes we have 5 cross 5 as well, but let's see what happens, right? So what I'm trying to explain is that with this 9 cross 9, even, so with just this 9 cross 9, this layer here gets to see this much of the image, but this 9 cross 9 here only gets to see this small patch. And this is the only message I want you to understand when we talk about receptive field. The size of the kernel doesn't change, right? The size of the kernel is still 9 cross 9. And obviously, in the very first layer, when we directly apply this kernel onto the input image, the receptive field is only 9 cross 9, meaning the activation of a neuron will only change if you change that 9 cross 9 part of the image, meaning that it's only that 9 cross 9 part of the image is what my network, what my kernel gets to see. But as we go down the network, because of this pooling and also this border effects of convolution, but mostly due to the pooling, right? So let's say, we started with this 512. Now, the 9 cross 9 after pooling, the 9 cross 9 on this 256 is already like 18 cross 18, right, in the original image. And then if we do it again, then it's 36 by 36 in the original image. The math is slightly complicated due to the border effects of convolution, because the size of the output is the size of the input minus kernel plus 1. So because of that minus kernel, the receptive field actually slightly becomes even bigger, right? So this is the only thing I need you to remember when we speak about receptive fields.